Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, before we carry on with the show, if you wouldn't mind sparing me a couple of minutes of your time, because it's helpful if I can keep the costs covered and potentially grow the show to help promote a little bit of the financial side. This show is brought to you, as always, by supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from more people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund it, especially in these hard times, to keep it going and help me to reach new audiences are very much appreciated. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales, or follow the link in the show notes, or go from the website to take a look. You will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards from as little as $2 a month. From early release of the regular weekly episodes to weekly bonus episodes and special edits of the main show. So if you don't like the promotional stuff or you don't like the intro at all, you can leave all that out. One person I'd like to thank this week is Mario, who signed up recently. He's another who is helping to keep the show going and help all the listeners get a good night's sleep. So thanks, Mario, for listening and for the support. But if signing up for monthly support seems a little bit much to commit to, there are the options as well. There's the tip jar, which is up on the website. It's a PayPal tip jar. And I had Nadine recently who contributed in there very generously, so thank you to you. And also there's the merchandise store and others as well. But another way you can help the show without having to reach into your pocket is to simply spread the word. If there's someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to it, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I can see and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. Last but not least, of course, I need to shout out the music, which, as always, for now, is Un Desert by Kumiku. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive. I've linked the website in the show notes, as they've got some very cool stuff released under various names that I recommend checking out. And a little teaser that I put in there, but the for now part. This is episode 97, and episode 100 is coming up soon. There's going to be a few changes to the show. First off, I'm looking at other royalty-free music to get some little bit change up in the music that I'm using. Trying to find, I've got a few other nice little guitar pieces that I'm sort of trying to choose between. It's going to be slight changes in the show art, and also maybe a little bit of a change in the introduction as well. I'm going to make it a little bit more sort of overtly meditative and a little bit less autobiographical, I think. I think that's probably what the future holds. And if all goes well, I'm also going to have my first original story for episode 100 since episode 50, actually. Time just doesn't allow me to do any writing for the show, unfortunately. So I'm doing what I can to try and get something sweet and fun and entertaining for you. And I've waffled on a little bit too much, so thanks for taking the time, and let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange thing, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I'm someone who I've struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. My parents had sleepless nights with me for many years, and even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, sleep really was always a struggle for me. Now, I knew some people liked sleeping with the TV or the radio on, but those sort of things didn't really work for me. I preferred to try to sleep in silence even though I was struggling, because TV and radio had problems with it. TV, the lights disturb me, and ads are generally a lot louder than the actual shows you listen to, so that would be disturbing. And the radio would often have music that I actually wanted to listen to, and also very loud advertising that would again disturb me when I was trying to sleep. But then I discovered the tendency for podcasts. When I went to bed with podcasts to listen to and expecting to lie awake all night, I found myself suddenly waking up having slept through everything that I was trying to listen to. I think there was something about the podcasts, the fact that they're pretty consistent volume across the whole length of the thing, and a little bit tamer and whatnot, and also obviously not having often loud music and the sort of thing as a distraction meant that they acted like a sedative for me. Once I worked through the backlog of the various podcasts that I was listening to, I discovered that there were other podcasts out there specifically intended for the purpose of helping people to sleep. I discovered one or two that worked for me quite well, but when I recommended them to others, for various reasons, sometimes they just didn't work. So I thought to myself, I've got a boring, drony voice and a fondness for telling long stories and the sound of my own voice. So I thought, let me give it a try and see if I can help some other people that the existing shows that I've respected quite a lot didn't really work for. Now, every episode starts with this long intro. Firstly, of course, as I've done, I've got to explain exactly what it's for. Also, for new listeners, I need to explain the structure and the sort of thought process behind it, which is something I'm about to get into. And for people who've been listening to the show for a longer time, it serves a slightly different purpose. Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a sort of space together or create new habits. In a lot of ways, insomnia is just really a bad habit. It's a bad mental discipline with things we've allowed ourselves to get caught up in that disturb our night. So by having this long intro before the story of every episode, create a sort of, for people who have been listening, a sort of like predisposition to sleep. By the time the story comes, if you've been listening to the show long enough, you probably won't even get to it. You should be asleep before the intro's over because the familiarity of it and the sort of ritual almost or habit creation that we're trying to create here. This is the part of the show where if you haven't yet, this is where you turn the lights out, brush your teeth, have a little drink of water, snuggle yourself down into your blankets, make sure your pillows are nicely puffed up and comfortable, and prepare yourself. Just get ready for sleep to come. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. For some people, the idea is actually that there is something specific to listen to. This is a story and a train of thought and a sequence of events to keep the mind focused so that when sleep comes for you, you don't have the tendency to resist. You have just enough focus not to see your restful night sneaking up. And for some people, it might be something a little bit more primal, something more like a white noise. Instead of the sound of the ocean or wind in the trees or the rain, you've got my droning voice instead. And tonight I'm going to be droning a classical tale, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. I selected it actually because I remember a movie version of it that I watched when I was younger being quite a sort of New Year's theme, which I suppose for something like The Time Machine makes sense. Although as I was reading through the story, I realized that doesn't seem to be part of the actual book itself. Nonetheless, still an interesting listen. A little bit dry, but still quite interesting. So actually a perfect candidate for a sleepy time tale story. But whatever the story is, whether it's a classic sci-fi or a celebration of New Year, which it turns out not to be, the main thing is you need to try not to force sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the story as I tell it and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, as I've said, if all goes well and once you've been listening to the show for a while, it probably will happen that you'll be asleep before I get to the end of the episode. But it is important that you don't feel pressurized. This may not work on your first night. It probably will take a few nights to probably 3 for you to get used to listening to my voice, adjusting my accent, or realize that this whole idea isn't quite as strange as it may seem. One thing that's possible as well, especially early on, is maybe one episode isn't long enough for you. Or maybe you have a slightly different sleep problem. Maybe your problem isn't that you can't get to sleep. Maybe your problem is that you wake up in the middle of the night. Best thing in my experience is to download a few episodes so that you don't have to be connected to the Wi-Fi or whatever, and start on the latest episode and just let them run through in the course of the night. That way, when you wake up at 3 a.m. or whatever, then you just pop your earbuds back in and get back to sleep again. And sometimes even something that I picked up recently as well, and this is something that I've had listeners thank me for mentioning, is that occasionally I wake up like sort of 30 minutes or 60 minutes before my alarm goes. What I do in that case is I do the exact same thing as if I woke up at 3 a.m. Pop the earbuds in and go back to sleep, and I can hear you, many of you saying to me right now, Dave, that is pointless. Why are you going to sleep with 30 minutes left on your alarm? And I'm going to tell you now, dear listener, that can be the best part of my night. There is something about allowing yourself deep relaxation right before the alarm that is just profoundly, profoundly satisfying. And so we get to the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me, because I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe it's not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope. Now, I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. But most importantly, you need to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Because frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep, and the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we'll try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy, or it feels like an enemy, but it isn't. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. So I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. From The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Introduction. The time traveller, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His pale grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, and his fecundity. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on misconception. Is not that a rather large thing to expect us to begin upon, said Fulby, an argumentative person with red hair? I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness null, has no real existence. They taught you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That is all right, said the psychologist. Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have a real existence. There I object, said Fulby. Of course a solid body may exist, all real things. So most people think. But wait a moment. Can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Fulby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Fulby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveller proceeded, any real body must have an extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we're inclined to overlook this fact. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call the 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter, from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that is very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveller, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the 4th dimension, though some people who talk about the 4th dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of the idea. You have all heard what they have to say about this 4th dimension. I have not, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why 3 dimensions particularly. Why not another direction at right angles to the other 3? And have even tried to construct a 4-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only 2 dimensions, we can represent a figure of 3-dimensional model. And similarly, they think that by models of 3 dimensions, they could represent one of 4, if they could master the perspective of the thing, see? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you, I have been at work upon this geometry of 4 dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here's a portrait of a man who at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were, 3-dimensional representations of his 4-dimension being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler, after the pause required for proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the Mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude, was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a 4th dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you so sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backwards and forwards freely enough, and men has always done so. I admit we move freely in 2 dimensions, but how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. Not exactly, said the medical man. They are balloons. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still they could move a little up and down, said the medical man. Easier, far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time, you cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from cradle to the grave. Just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery. But you are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I'm recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope that ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? Oh, this, began Philby, is all. Why not? Said the time traveler. It's against reason, said Philby. What reason? Said the time traveler. You can show me black as white by argument, said Philby, but you will never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveler. But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine. To travel through time, exclaimed the very young man. That shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time, as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experimental verification, said the time traveler. It would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. Don't you think you would attract attention, said the medical man. Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato, the very young man thought. In which case they would certainly plough for you the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much. Then there is the future, said the very young man. Just think, One might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulated interest, and hurry on ahead. To discover a society, said I, erected on a strictly communistic basis. Of all the wild, extravagant theories, began the psychologist. Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until experimental verification, cried I. You're going to verify that? The experiment, cried Philby, who was getting brain-weary. Let's see your experiment anyhow, said the psychologist, though it's all humbug, you know. The time traveller smiled around at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trouser pockets, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. I wonder what he's got. Some sleight of hand trick or another, said the medical man. And Philby tried to tell us about some conjurer he had seen at Burslem. But before he had finished his preface, the time traveller came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. 2. The machine. The thing the time traveller held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire, with 2 legs on the hearthrug. On this table he placed the mechanism. Then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, 2 in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several in sconces, so that the room was brightly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward, so as to be almost between the time traveller and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile from the right, the psychologist from the left. The very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveller looked at us, and then at the mechanism. Well, said the psychologist. This little affair, said the time traveller, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly askew, and that there's an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it were in some way unreal. He pointed to that part with his finger. Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another. The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. It's beautifully made, he said. It took 2 years to make, retorted the time traveller. Then, when we had all imitated the action of the medical man, he said, Now I want you clearly to understand that this lever, being pressed over, sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of a time traveller. Presently, I am going to press the lever and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table too, and satisfy yourself there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and then be told I'm a quack. There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveller put forth his finger towards the lever. No, he said suddenly, lend me your hand. And turning to the psychologist, he took that individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger. So that it was the psychologist himself who set forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I'm absolutely certain there was no trickery. There was a breath of wind, and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung around, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second perhaps, as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and then it was gone, vanished. Save for the lamp, the table was bare. Everyone was silent for a moment. Then Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. Well, he said, with reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us, began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. Look here, said the medical man. Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that that machine has travelled into time? Certainly, said the time traveller, stooping to light a spill in the fire. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it and cut. What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there. He indicated the laboratory, and when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. You mean to say that that machine has travelled into the future, said Philby. Into the future or the past. I don't for certain know which. After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. It must have gone into the past if it has gone anywhere, he said. Why, said the time traveller. Because I presume it has not moved in space. And if it travelled into the future, it would still be here all this time. So it must have travelled through this time. But, said I, if it travelled into the past, it would have been visible when we came first into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor, with an air of impartiality, turning towards the time traveller. Not a bit, said the time traveller. And to the psychologist, you think. You can explain that. Its presentation below the threshold, diluted presentation. Of course, said the psychologist, and reassured us. There's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning, or a bullet flying through the air. If it is travelling through time 50 or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression it creates will of course be the only 1/50th or 100th of what it would make if it were not travelling in time. That's plain enough. He passed his hand to the space in which the machine had been. You see, he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveller asked us what we thought of it all. It sounds plausible enough tonight, said the medical man, but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the time traveller. And therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, draughty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer, broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts were of nickel, parts were of ivory, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench, beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz it seemed to be. Look here, said the medical man. Are you perfectly serious? Or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas? Upon that machine, said the time traveller, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life. None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly. 3. The time traveller returns. I think that time none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveller was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all around him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveller's words, we would have shown him far less skepticism. For we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby. But the time traveller had more than a touch of whim about his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of a less clever man seemed tricks in his hands. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never felt quite sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think any of us said very much about time traveling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of an anachronism, and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model that I remember discussing with a medical man whom I met on Friday at the Linnaean. He said he had seen a similar thing at Tübingen and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. But how the trick was done he could not explain. The next Thursday I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveller's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked around for the time traveller and, "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we'd better have dinner." "Where's," said I, naming our host. "You've just come?" "It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes." "It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were Blank, the editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard, whom I didn't know, and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveller's absence, and I suggested time travelling in a half-jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed that day week. He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said at last. And the door opened wider, and the time traveller stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man who saw him next, and the whole tableful turned toward the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty and smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair disordered and, as it seemed to me, greyer, either with dust and dirt or because its colour had actually faded. His face was a ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half healed. His expression was haggard and drawn as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I've seen in footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveller did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said, with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint colour came into his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then went around the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were feeling his way among the words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveller. Funny. Be right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute perhaps my mind was wool-gathering. Then, "Remarkable behaviour of an eminent scientist," I heard the editor say, thinking, after his wont, in headlines. And this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur cadger? I don't follow." I met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. I thought of the time traveller limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from the surprise was the medical man who rang the bell. The time traveller hated to have servants waiting at dinner for a hot plate. At that, the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt, and the silent man followed suit. The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while, with gaps of wonderment. Then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. "Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing, or has he had his Nebuchadnezzar phases?" he inquired. "I feel assured it's this business of the time machine," I said, and took up the psychologist's account of our previous meeting. The new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What was this time travelling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox, could he? And then, as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule on the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalist, very joyous, irreverent young men. "Our special correspondent in the Day After Tomorrow reports," the journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveller came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. "I say," said the editor hilariously, "these chaps here say you have been travelling into the middle of next week. Tell us all about little Rosebery, will you? What will you take for the lot?" The time traveller came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick fork into meat again." "Story," cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveller. "I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries, thanks. And the salt?" "One word," said I. "Have you been time travelling?" "Yes," said the time traveller, with his mouth full, nodding his head. "I'll give you $1 a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveller pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Haiti Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked around us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time." He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates." And ringing the bell in passing, he led the way to the adjoining room. "You have told a blank and dash and chose about the machine," he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the 3 new guests. "But the thing's a mere paradox," said the editor. "I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue. I will," he went on, "tell you the story of what has happened to me, if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of it will sound like lying, so be it. It's true, every word of it, all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days. Such days as no human ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep till I've told this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed, but no interruptions. Is it agreed?" "Agreed," said the editor, and the rest of us echoed, "Agreed." And with that, the time traveler began his story as I have set it forth. He sat back in his chair at first and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards, he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression followed the turns of his story. Most of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at each other. After a time we ceased to do that, and looked only at the time traveller's face. 4. Time traveling. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine, and showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete in the workshop. There it is now, a little travel-worn truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked and the brass rail bent, but the rest of it's sound enough. I expected to finish it on Friday, but on Friday, when putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short, and this I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all the time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, and put 1 more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and stopping one in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking around, I saw the laboratory as exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment I suspected that my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it seemed, it had stood at a minute or so past 10. Now it was nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Mrs. Watchett came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse the place, but to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback, of a helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute, and every minute marking a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed and I'd come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving thing. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The tinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then in the intermittent darkness I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters, from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous greyness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous colour like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space. The moon, a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside above which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapour, now brown, now green. They grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed change, melting and flowing in under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced around faster and faster. Presently I noticed that the sun belts swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less, and that consequently my place was over a year a minute, and a minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world and vanished and was followed by the brief bright green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked indeed a clumsy swaying of the machine for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend to it, and with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations. But presently a fresh series of impressions grew up in my mind, a certain curiosity and therewith a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet, as it seemed, built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there, without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. The peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied. So long as I travelled at a high velocity through time, that scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated, was slipping like a vapour through the interstices of intervening substances. But to come to a stop involved the jamming of myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my path, meant bringing my atoms into such intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, possibly a far-reaching explosion, would result, and blow myself and my apparatus out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. The possibility had to occur to me again and again while I was making the machine, but then I cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk. One of the risks a man has got to take. Now, the risk was inevitable. I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. The fact is that, insensibly, the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all, the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerves. I told myself that I could never stop, and with a gust of petulance I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I tugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. There was the sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing around me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed grey, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked round me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a little cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," said I, "to a man who has travelled innumerable years to see you." Presently I thought what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked around me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons through the hazy downpour, but all else of the world was invisible. My sensations would be hard to describe. As the columns of hail grew thinner, I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched his shoulder. It was of white marble and shaped something like a winged sphinx, but the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze and was thick with verdigris. It chanced that the face was towards me. The sightless eyes seemed to watch me. There was the faint shadow of a smile on the lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. I stood looking at it for a little space, half a minute perhaps, or half an hour. It seemed to advance and to recede as the hail drove before it, denser or thinner. At last I tore my eyes from it for a moment and saw that the hail curtain had worn threadbare, and that the sky was lightening with promise of the sun. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened to men? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if in this interval the race had lost its manliness, and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old-world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. Already I saw other vast shapes, huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to readjust it. As I did so the shafts of the sun smote through the thunderstorm. The grey downpour was swept aside and vanished like the trailing garments of a ghost. Above me, in the intense blue of the summer sky, some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood out clear and distinct, shining with the wet of the thunderstorm and picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones piled along their courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above and will swoop. My fear grew to frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. It gave under my desperate onset and turned over. It struck my chin violently. One hand on the saddle, the other on the lever, I stood panting heavily in attitude to mount again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the remote future. In the circular opening, high up in the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed towards me. Then I heard voices approaching me. Coming through the bushes by the White Sphinx were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged in a pathway leading straight to my little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, girdled at the waist with a leather belt. Sandals or buskins, I could not clearly distinguish which, were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees and his head was bare. Noticing that, I noticed for the first time how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence. I took my hands from the machine. And with that, I think I'll call it a night. As ever, if you have enjoyed what you've heard so far, you can find the book on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Interestingly enough, I'll make an extra recommendation here too. There's a book by Stephen Baxter, The Time Ships, which is an actual sequel to The Time Machine, which gets very hectic and goes in very interesting directions. Not exactly a relaxing read, not sure I'd recommend it before bedtime, faces you with the enormity of the future, but a fascinating read nonetheless that builds on the ideas in this novel. And thanks for joining me. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Desire by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.